This is the Amazing Spider-Man for the original Nintendo Game Boy, and Amazing Spider-Man is the first of 3 Game Boy titles featuring your friendly neighborhood wall crawler long before he made a deal with the devil. Developed by Rare and published by LGN Toys, the story of Amazing Spider-Man goes like this. Mary Jane has been kidnapped by spider villains and you, as Spider-Man, have to go through 6 levels of pain to save her. Gee, I wonder if it would have been worth the effort had I known what was going to happen a decade or so from now. So the concept of the game seems simple enough. Each level has you using your spider powers such as punching and kicking and web slinging to overcome obstacles and thugs to reach the spider villain at the end. Defeating enemies will net you items, and you can also find burgers to regain some health. On paper, it looks like your typical day for your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Unfortunately, if there was one glaring issue that plagues the Amazing Spider-Man is the amazingly god-awful controls. Pressing the B button punches after an extremely long delay. Another LGN published game with long delaying punches, and this one's even slower. You can circumvent the slowness of your punch by performing a crouching kick, which comes out a tad quicker, but it has slightly longer recovery time, and you run the risk of missing the power-ups that pop out of defeated enemies, because they hit the ground, they're gone for good. Also, if you hold down the B button for a second, you can shoot a web projectile that can be used to damage enemies. This costs webbing, of course, and once you're out of webbing, you can web no more. This projectile thing's kind of interesting. You shoot different kinds of webbing depending on how many web cartridges you're carrying. The more you have, the more effective your webbing. However, it doesn't really matter since you can't really do any awesome Spider-Man stuff like trap enemy in webs or anything like that. It's just a slow-moving and largely inefficient projectile attack that isn't really worth the effort of using unless you're fighting a boss or something. The jumping mechanics are also spectacularly flawed. The only good news is that the A button jumps. Sigh of relief there. However, beyond that, it's a different story. Tapping A will make Spider-Man perform a short hop. No problem there. Pressing A while walking will make Spider-Man jump really high. Or at least it's supposed to. Sometimes it works after just a few steps, other times it doesn't, but at the very least it seems to work just fine when you really need it, such as this rooftop level. And since this is Spider-Man, they managed to incorporate his web slinging into the game. By holding A while in the air, Spider-Man can web sling to his heart's content, as long as he has web fluid left over, of course. This game does offer some challenge by having you make use of Spidey's sensational abilities, and with a limited number of continues, you're best served to take your time and try not to rush things. You do respawn at the approximate point of your last death, which makes things a tad easier, but the faulty controls do not help matters either. Nor does the fact that you have no window of invisibility each time you take damage. As long as you are touching any enemy or obstacle, you will continually take damage, a constant irritant in any video game that includes this feature. Just about the only parts that seem to work well in this game are the wall crawling segments, which has you crawling up a wall, all the while avoiding thugs, birds, and other things that will trigger your spider sense. Once you reach an open window, press A to jump and it's back to the not-so-amazing platforming segments. Sound-wise, Amazing Spider-Man has a handful of soundtracks, and while the title music's rather nice touch applying some of the classic 60s cartoon theme music in there. That's a nice touch. The rest of it's sort of meh. Yeah, it's just meh. Maybe even below meh. But meh, nonetheless. You only have 3 tunes playing during actual gameplay, a standard meh tune that plays during the platforming segments, a boss tune that's almost lively but ultimately forgettable, the tune that plays during the wall crawling segments that actually brings about some level of tension but not all that great. The intermission that plays between levels has this loopy sound that's almost, kinda, sorta catchy, but Battletoads pause music this is not. Speaking of those intermissions, they look okay-ish. You could sort of recognize some of the villains even if they look kinda crappy. So the intermissions are kinda okay-ish, but not as good as the title screen, which looks pretty nice, especially with the right color palette applied on the Super Game Boy. Seems like most of the effort went towards making the opening screens of the game look as best as they could, because the drop in quality is something fierce, which isn't to say the visuals in general are terrible. For what it is, the various backdrops look alright, the various enemies look kinda decent, but Spider-Man himself looks like a skinny teenager, and by skinny teenager, I mean punier than puny Parker. This isn't going to win any awards. I don't think it actually did win anything, but it looks alright. Let's just call it a buff meh, and just call it a day. This is a bit of an anomaly we have in our hands here. On the surface, Amazing Spider-Man seems like a pretty average and straightforward platform game with some web slinging and wall climbing aspects thrown in for good measure, and it looks like it could have been pretty decent and fun to play. But ultimately, the entire package is marred with a really clunky and barely tolerable control scheme that stands a fair chance of ruining the game's replayability. Despite all the control issues, delayed responses, and unstable collision detection that plague the game, Amazing Spider-Man is still remotely playable and is by far the best game of the original Game Boy trilogy. Of course, since the sequels have taken such a drastic drop in quality control, that's not really saying much and really is not really anything to be proud of. Oh well, it ain't the worst of the 3 games, so at the very least, Amazing Spider-Man for the original Game Boy has that much going for it. Man.